Welcome back. We have finished our quilt top. Now we need to decide how we want to finish the quilt. So you have the choice of long arm machine quilting it. You can tack it with your sewing machine, you can tie it by hand, or you can use a birthing method and make a blanket. Which one you choose will depend upon what you have available to you. If you're lucky, you'll have a long arm machine and you can actually long arm machine your quilt. If you're not so lucky, you'll have to find a long arm machine quilter. If you need your quilt back quickly, you can do a machine tack or a hand tie. Or if you need it really, really fast in like 10 minutes, you can do a birthing method and make a blanket. I've tried to quilt my quilts on a regular sewing machine, but I have not had any success. Even with a hopping darning foot, the t-shirt material pulls, stretches, bunches, and it's just pretty miserable to work with. Some quilters have found success on their home sewing machines. If you've had success quilting on a home sewing machine and would like to try to quilt your quilt with that machine, I would suggest making a trial quilt and practice and see if it works for you. If you're really lucky, you'll have your own long arm quilting machine. But if you're like most people, you'll need to find a long arm quilter. To find a long arm quilter in your area, check out your local fabric stores with other quilters or with your local quilt guild. You can also hire 2 cool t-shirt quilts to do your quilting. So you have the name of a long arm machine quilter. Before you actually send your quilt to them, I would interview them and ask them what type of quilting they do. Do they do a pantograph quilting? Do they do each block quilting? Will they quilt your quilt since it doesn't have iron-on backing? Those are just some of the beginning questions to ask. Then look at what they're actually doing. Look for quilts that will hang square. You want to look for nice, even, flat fronts on your quilts. On the back of your quilt, you want to make sure that there are no lumps or bumps, no batting that's lumpy. You want to make sure there's no tucks or pleats in the back. The backing should be very smooth. You also want to look at the quilting that they've done. We like to do our quilts where each block gets its own unique design. Some quilters want to do an overall. You need to decide what is good for you and your quilt. This is what a quilt will look like when each block has its own unique design. Look at what your quilter can do for you. And you also want to just really get a feel if you like how that would feel on your quilt. So spend some time, look at their quilts, and think about how that will work on your quilt. Ask to see a quilt that is not overall stitched or pantograph quilted, because your t-shirt quilt should not be overall quilted. Overall quilting is when the quilter works from the back of the machine and follows a repeating pattern from left to right across the quilt. Because of the stretch of the material, if an overall quilting pattern is used, the top will be pulled from one side to the other as the quilting's done. This may turn your quilt into a parallelogram. Another practice to avoid is a computer-driven quilting pattern. The quilter needs to stand at the front of the quilt and use one hand to run the machine and the other to work the fabric. Occasionally, the t-shirt material will need to be smoothed or manipulated. If the quilting machine is driven by a computer and no one's watching, the t-shirt fabric may buckle or tuck. Let's talk a little bit more about long arm quilting a quilt. I like to quilt each block differently. I like to do that because it makes a much more interesting back than if you would just do an overall design. It also allows you to trace items on the t-shirt. So on the front of this quilt, there's owls, and on the back, you see different owls. I think that's a lot of fun, and it's also really fun for the person who's going to get this quilt. One of the things that most people do when they see the backs of one of my quilts are go, wow, I didn't expect that. And so it's one way to really pop up and make your quilt more interesting than somebody else's quilt who's just doing an overall quilting. One of the things we also think about when we are quilting our quilts is making sure that there is a difference between the backing and the thread color. We really want to have that thread pop so you see the designs pop off. If I was going to use the same royal blue thread on the back, you'd never see any of the quilting and you would lose that really neat effect. Ask your long arm quilter, can you do free form quilting? If they can't, I would say find another quilter. If they're willing to try, then I would ask for a discount on your quilting. If you can't find anybody to do quilting like this, you're always welcome to hire 2 cool t-shirt quilts and we can quilt your quilt for you. Let's talk batting. Batting is what goes in the middle of your quilt. There are a lot of different types of batting out there, and you can choose whichever one you want. Here at Too Cool T-Shirt Quilts, we like to use Hobbs 80-20 batting. It's 80% cotton, 20% polyester. It's needle punched, which means hot needles will go into it when they're making it and pull the polyester threads up through the cotton. It makes it a very stable batting. You can pull on it and it's not going to break apart. A lot of people think that you need to have a thick batting to have a warm quilt, but you really don't. You just really only need a very thin batting. And a t-shirt quilt gets very heavy, so having anything heavier than this will just make for a really, really heavy quilt. It'll be more difficult to work with and not as easy to use. Another consideration with your batting is if it will shrink. Shrinkage is not good. So with the Hobbs 80-20, we've not had any problem with shrinkage. This quilt's probably been washed over 150 times, and in all that time we've had no issue with shrinkage. Some quilters will shy away from this project because you haven't used iron-on backing. They're scared that the t-shirt material will stretch. Because the quilts have temporary binding, this is not an issue. In your PDF package, you'll find some samples of quilting designs for long arm quilting. Now I'm going to talk about how to tie and tack your quilt. We're going to use one quilt to do both things. You need a large workspace to spread out your backing material. Most people don't have a table large enough to do this on, so you need to have a nice clean floor that you can spread out on and work on. So let's first take our backing material. Since I'm tacking and tying this quilt, I'm going to use a printed material. That'll help hide the tacks a little bit. First thing you want to do is find the bad side of your material. Materials have a good side and a bad side. You want to have your bad side facing up. So I'm going to use the light blue side as my bad side. I'm going to spread it out over my table. Next, I want to make sure that this is going to stay flat and nice and neat and not bunch on me and not wrinkle. I'm going to do that by actually physically taping the backing down to the table. Masking tape. It works great. So I'm going to start at one end and work around and make sure that it's all nice and straight. Now we've tacked 4 sides. Now I want to tack each of the corners down with some masking tape. Now if you had a bigger piece of material, you'd probably want to fill in a few more areas. But for what we're doing right now, this is plenty big. So this is my bad side of my backing material. Next in the sandwich is the batting, Hobbs 80-20. You want to lay this out very neatly and nice and smoothly. So now we're putting the quilt top on. It may not look like I have enough batting here, but it's just hidden under the temporary binding, but you're fine as long as it goes out to the edge of your quilt. All laid out very smooth and nice looking. I don't have it stretched one way or the other. It's just there. So the next step, safety pins. We're going to pin in a very similar pattern to how we taped the backing down. We're going to pin on the temporary binding at the top and bottom. Make sure you catch all 3 layers. We're pinning the 3 layers together so that when you take this off the table, they'll stay together. So continue pinning. Pin all around the outside of the quilt, probably 5 to 6 to 8 inches between the pins, depending on how large your quilt is and how patient you are. First, I'm going to show you how to tie a quilt on the top half of this practice quilt. Then I'll show you how to machine tack on the bottom part of the quilt. So to tie a quilt, we use embroidery floss. And I use an embroidery needle, scissors, and some fray check. Your quilt's built on a 4-inch grid. And so I'm going to put a tie at each intersection here. That way I tie it every 4 inches. So I'll put a tie here, 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 and along here, using this as my guide. I try to cut a piece of embroidery floss that's at least the width of the quilt. I actually put this in my mouth and use my teeth to make the embroidery floss go from round to flat. And it goes through your needle much easier that way. So I'm going to put my first tie right here. This is going to scratch your floor or your tabletop, so be careful because this is a sharp needle. You need a sharp needle to get through the 3 layers. So I'm going down And I'm feeling till I get through 3 layers and I'm coming back up. So what I'm doing is I am taking a stitch in and out about every 4 inches. Doesn't have to be exact. Next, grab your scissors and you're going to cut in between every stitch. So go back to the beginning now, grab your 2 ends and just make a simple granny knot. Now that we've made knots in our entire row, our next step is to decide how much string we want to leave. You can make your decision. You can use your finger as a guide. You could use paper as a guide. However you want, just choose however long you want your tassels to be. Now the fun part. Granny knots like to come undone. So I use fray check, which is a plastic glue that dries clear to make each knot perfectly tight and it will never come undone. A little drop of this on each knot. Now you have the choice of how you want to handle the ends of your ties. You can either leave them like they are and they'll just come undone and become fuzzy. Or if you want to keep them just like they are now, you can put a drop of fray check on each end. Then continue on working down your quilt until you have the entire quilt tied. You can draw on top of your map if you want, so you can know exactly where every tie will go. Now let's look at machine tacking your quilt. To machine tack, we're going to take this up off the table and use our sewing machine to put the tacks in. We need to put more safety pins in the area that we're going to be tacking in so that the quilt does not become separated from the backing. So we want to keep all layers nice and stable, so we're going to do that with some more safety pins. Now that we've got enough safety pins inside the quilt that it won't come apart from each other, we're going to take the masking tape off and then roll the quilt in so we'll be ready to sew. We're going to put tacks every 4 inches, just like we showed putting ties every 4 inches. I'm going to work from one side to the other, from the top to the bottom. I have this rolled up so it's out of my way and not hard to work with. I have my machine set on a button stitch. The button stitch is just a back and forth tack that would put on a button. We're just going to use it to tack the quilt. You're going to work your quilt under the machine. Approximately figure out where your 4 inches is. It does not have to be perfect. That's one tack. Move your work forward, but don't cut that off. Just wait and we'll do it all at one time. Once you get to the bottom of your quilt, you're going to cut off your last seam. Then you're going to roll this and come back to the beginning and start your next row of tacks. You're going to work your way up and down your quilt until you have it all tacked. And just keep working your way, and you'll roll this and unroll this side. You work from bottom to top or top to bottom. When you have put all your tacks in, then you have to deal with your strings. You're going to have a string on the front and you're going to have strings on the back. What I do is I go in and I put a drop of fray check on each tack. By the time you get to the bottom of your quilt with fray checking, the top will be dry and you'll be ready then to cut your strings off. That takes care of your top strings. Then you'll flip your quilt over, and you can barely see my tacks here because I use the same color thread as the backing material. But I still have strings that I need to fix. You don't need to re-glue it. Glue on the front soak through to the back. So you just need to come along and cut your strings off. So that's how you machine tack a t-shirt quilt. So on the front, you're going to see just a little bit. On the back, if you use matching thread, you're not going to see anything. Another option for finishing your quilt is to use the birthing method. This is basically sew around the outside, turn it inside out, and call it good. Let's show you how to do it. First, you need your polar fleece or some other heavy material for your backing. Lay your fabric out on the work surface. If you have a really large piece of fabric, you probably need to work on the floor. If your backing material has two sides, a good side and a bad side, put the good side up, bad side down. Next, grab your quilt top. You want to marry the good faces together. So we're going to put the good side down to match the good side of the backing material. Next, we're going to pin around the entire outside of the quilt. We're going to pin about every 4 to 8 inches. Work to make sure that the quilt's nice and flat. We're going to work from one end to the other. You want to make sure that you don't have any lumps and bumps in your backing material or your quilt. Next, we're going to sew around the perimeter of the quilt. We want to make sure that we leave a space open so that we can inside out the quilt when we're finished sewing. So what I do is I grab a couple extra pins and I decide where I'm going to stop and start. So I'm going to make a pin here and there. I know if I come to 2 pins, I should not go beyond that. So this will be my opening right here. I will sew from here all the way around, back to here where we have 2 more pins. This will be our opening where we inside out the quilt. I'm just going to have a basic straight stitch set up on my machine. When I begin, I'm going to sew forward, backwards, forward, so I have an extra strong stitch at that location. I'm using just basic white thread and a presser foot, which will be my guide. As I come to pins, I will pull them out. When you come to your corner, you can decide to do a square corner or a rounded corner. It'll depend on how you want the front of your quilt to look. I'm going to do a square corner. So I'm just going to lift up my presser foot and turn. I have finished sewing around the entire perimeter of the quilt. Now I need to trim off this excess fabric. I'm going to do that with a rotary cutter and ruler. Simply line the ruler up against the edge of the t-shirt quilt. Now that we've cut off all the excess fabric, we're going to turn it inside out, the birthing part. Reach your hand in. Then I reach my hand into each corner and pop out the corner. Now we need to close the hole. We can do this by hand or with our sewing machine. We also can choose to sew along the edge of the quilt, and I'm going to do that and close it at the same time. First, I'm going to pin the opening closed so it's just how I want it when I actually go to sew it. This will be the first area that I sew over. I have white in the top of my machine and I have blue on the bottom because I have a blue backing, and I'm just going to use the white on the top. I have finished top stitching around the outside of the blanket. So this is what our blanket looks like. A blanket's quick, yes, but it's an inferior product and it won't last as long as an actual quilt. Now that you're done either tacking, tying, or quilting your quilt, you're ready to take that temporary binding off, and we'll do that next.